Angevin Empire, a name that sounds pretty epic, right? It was one of the most powerful realms in the 12th and 13th centuries, covering much of England, about half of France, parts of Ireland, and even parts of Wales. At its height, the Angevin Empire wasn't just big, it was complex, a sort of early blend of nations under one ruler, which is why historians call it a composite monarchy. So this empire got its start with Henry II of England. He wasn't just any ruler, he had an impressive lineup of titles and territories. Henry took over from his father, Geoffrey, as Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 brought in the vast and wealthy lands of Aquitaine. On top of all that, he claimed the English throne through his mother, Empress Matilda, and he officially became king in 1154 after the death of his rival, Stephen. But here's the twist. Although England was their crown jewel, the Plantagenet kings actually spent most of their time on the continent, especially in places like Angers in Anjou and Chinon in Touraine. Their empire's size and power soon put them in conflict with the French kings, who belonged to the House of Capet. This tension kicked off a long period of rivalry and wars, shaping both England and France for centuries to come. One big blow came in the early 1200s when Henry's son, King John, lost most of these territories to France after the Battle of Bouvines. This defeat set the stage for even more battles and eventually led to the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would see England temporarily regain and then finally lose its continental lands. So where did this name, Angevin Empire, come from? It's actually a term created later by historians. Angevin comes from the region of Anjou in France, where Henry's family, the Plantagenets, came from. Henry II, his sons Richard the Lionheart and John, and even John's brother Geoffrey, who ruled Brittany, were all part of this empire. But back in their day, no one called it the Angevin Empire. In fact, Henry II and his successors referred to it more vaguely as our kingdom and everything subject to our rule. It wasn't until the 19th century that historian Kate Norgate officially coined the term in her book, England Under the Angevin Kings. Interestingly, not everyone agrees with calling it an empire. Some historians argue it was really just a loose collection of lands with little unity beyond being ruled by the same king. Unlike a true empire, there wasn't one clear identity uniting all these territories. The Plantagenets didn't even claim an imperial title like the Holy Roman Empire or Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile, who went by Emperor of all Spain. Instead, Henry and his descendants were simply kings of England, with other titles that kept their French possessions under the authority of the French king. Because of this loose structure, some historians prefer calling it a commonwealth instead of an empire, highlighting how it was more a coalition of independent regions than a unified state. At its largest, the Angevin Empire included the Kingdom of England, the Lordship of Ireland, and a number of duchies and counties in France, like Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. They also held some influence over regions like Brittany, Cornwall, the Welsh princedoms, and even parts of Scotland, though these areas weren't technically part of the empire. But ruling over so much land wasn't easy. Power was divided and administered locally, often by appointed officials. England was the most tightly governed area, with a network of sheriffs and a justiciar who managed things when the king was away. In France, though, control was much looser and varied across regions. Some areas like Normandy were well administered, but others, like Gascony and Aquitaine, were so decentralized that local lords ruled as if they were independent. Financially, England was the backbone of the empire, as it brought in a steady revenue that helped fund wars and other continental campaigns. Normandy also generated a substantial income, but areas like Aquitaine were harder to tax consistently because of the powerful local lords. And the rise of the Angevin Empire is a tale of alliances, battles, and the calculated ambitions of a few powerful figures. By the mid-12th century, the stage was set for Henry II to become a dominant figure not just in England but across vast swaths of France. When Henry's father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, died in 1151, the young Henry inherited not just the County of Anjou but also Touraine in Maine. Now, there was some family drama brewing because Geoffrey had initially wanted to leave Anjou to his younger son, also named Geoffrey. This created tensions that would come to the surface later, but at the time, Henry's claim to his father's legacy went unchallenged, largely because he had the support of the Angevin barons. Then came one of the most pivotal moments. Eleanor of Aquitaine entered the picture. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe, recently divorced from Louis VII of France. Within just a couple of months, she married Henry, and suddenly, he became Duke of Aquitaine and Gascony and Count of Poitou. This marriage added vast territories in southwestern France to Henry's control, which must have sent shockwaves through the European power dynamics. Louis VII wasn't going to take this lying down. He launched attacks on Normandy, and Henry's enemies, including his own brother Geoffrey, formed alliances against him. This was a dangerous time. Normandy, Anjou, and England, all the territories Henry was trying to unify, were under threat. But Henry, ever the strategist, managed to outmaneuver most of his enemies. When his brother Geoffrey revolted, Henry acted quickly and forced him to surrender. Now, across the Channel, things were getting equally intense. Stephen, who was still clinging to the English throne, was under pressure. Henry sailed to England in 1153, determined to press his claim. The conflict dragged on for months, but then something unexpected happened. Stephen's son Eustace, who was supposed to inherit the throne, died suddenly. This changed everything. Facing mounting pressure and with no clear heir, Stephen agreed to the Treaty of Winchester, naming Henry as his successor. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry finally became King of England. It was the culmination of years of struggle, negotiation, and sheer determination. But Henry's problems weren't over. The question of Anjou still lingered. His younger brother Geoffrey wasn't about to let it go. Geoffrey rebelled again, but Henry decisively crushed the uprising. By 1156, the rebellion was over, and Geoffrey had to settle for an annual pension. And just like that, the Angevin Empire was born, a sprawling domain stretching from the Scottish borders in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. It wasn't just a collection of territories, it was a patchwork of fiercely independent lands, all tied together under Henry's rule. This empire, though impressive, would prove to be as fragile as it was vast, but for now, Henry stood at the height of his power. And in so, Henry II wasn't just sitting back and watching things unfold. He was always on the move. Early in his reign, Henry's strategy was all about securing his borders and expanding his influence. He didn't just rely on brute force. It was a mix of clever diplomacy, calculated marriages, and strategic alliances. Take Scotland, for example. King David I had grabbed some prime real estate, Cumberland, Westmoreland, and Northumberland, while England was in chaos during the anarchy. But once Henry II came to power, he wasn't about to let that slide. He brought Malcolm IV, David's grandson, to the negotiating table in 1157. Now, Malcolm tried to remind Henry of an oath made earlier about the lands north of Newcastle belonging to Scotland forever, but Henry wasn't buying it. Let's face it, he held the bigger stick in this negotiation. Malcolm handed over those territories but got to keep Huntingdon as a consolation prize. Not a bad trade, considering the alternative. Then, there's Brittany. This place was a bit of a mess after Duke Conin's death in 1148. His son, Hole, was sidelined because of doubts about his legitimacy, and his daughter, Bertha, took over with her husband, Udo. But here's the twist. Bertha had a son from her first marriage, Conan IV, and Henry saw an opportunity. This kid had lands in England, making him easier for Henry to control. Fast forward to 150, and the citizens of Nantes, unhappy with Hull's rule, rose up and made Henry's brother Geoffrey their count. With a little nudge from Henry, of course. After some scuffling, Conan IV ended up as Duke of Brittany, but only after agreeing to Henry's terms. By 1160, Conan couldn't keep the duchy in order, so Henry stepped in again. He married Conan's daughter, Constance, to his son Geoffrey and took Brittany under direct Angevin control. It's classic Henry, always thinking several steps ahead. Over in Wales, things were a bit trickier. Welsh leaders like Rhys of Deheubarth and Owain Gwynedd weren't about to let Henry push them around. Henry tried negotiations, but the terms he offered were too harsh, so the Welsh revolted. After a few failed invasions, Henry brought out the big guns in 1164, assembling a massive army from across his domains. But nature had other plans. Terrible weather and relentless Welsh guerrilla tactics forced Henry to retreat. Furious, he ordered hostages mutilated as punishment. Eventually, though, he realized that brute force wouldn't work here. By 1171, with his focus shifting to Ireland, he turned back to diplomacy with Lord Rhys, striking a more sustainable deal. Speaking of Ireland, this was another area Henry had his eye on. The Pope had given him the green light back in 1155 to bring Ireland under the fold of Latin Christendom, but Henry had been too busy with other issues to act. When an exiled Irish king, Dermot of Leinster, sought his help in 1167, Henry saw his chance. He let Dermot recruit Anglo-Norman knights to reclaim his lands, and these knights carved out territories for themselves in Ireland. Alarmed by their growing power, Henry landed in Ireland in 1171. Most Irish kings quickly submitted, seeing the writing on the wall. Henry installed his own men in key positions and even made his son John the Lord of Ireland in 1177. But John's immaturity led to a botched rule in 1185, uniting Irish chieftains and Norman settlers against him. It wasn't until much later that stability returned. And then there was Toulouse, a long-standing thorn in Henry's side. Eleanor's ancestors had claims to the region, but Toulouse was heavily fortified and wealthy, making it a tough nut to crack. In 1159, Henry assembled one of the largest armies of the time, including allies from Gascony to Scotland. Even a Welsh prince joined in. Despite overwhelming force, Henry couldn't take the city. King Louis VII of France was defending it, and Henry wasn't about to risk capturing his own overlord. Over the next decade, he kept up the pressure, wearing down Raymond of Toulouse until, in 1173, Raymond finally gave in and paid homage to Henry and his sons. And after the Angevin Empire reached its zenith, its cracks became increasingly evident as internal rebellions and external threats mounted. The most pressing issue was the division of Henry II's vast territories among his sons. While Henry II saw this as a strategic move to manage his holdings, it ultimately sowed discord among his heirs, leading to constant power struggles. By the 1180s, Richard the Lionheart was firmly in control of Aquitaine, though his heavy-handed governance caused friction, particularly in regions like Périgord and Limousin. Meanwhile, his younger brother Geoffrey was stirring trouble in Brittany. Philip II of France, a calculating and shrewd monarch, saw an opportunity to exploit these familial tensions to weaken the Angevin hold over France. In 1183, Henry the young king, fed up with his position as a titular ruler without real power, aligned himself with Richard's enemies in Aquitaine. This coalition, which included Philip II, Count Raymond of Toulouse, and Duke Hugh of Burgundy, sought to overthrow Richard. However, fate intervened when the young king died suddenly from an illness during the rebellion. This unexpected loss not only preserved Richard's position in Aquitaine, but also marked a turning point in the shifting alliances of the time. Richard's defiance toward his father, Henry II, reached its peak after Geoffrey's death in 1186. When Henry ordered Richard to cede Aquitaine to his youngest brother John, Richard outright refused. This defiance set the stage for one of the most dramatic family betrayals in medieval history. The ultimate blow to Henry II came in 1189 when Richard openly allied with Philip II against his father. Together, they mounted a relentless campaign, forcing Henry to retreat to Chinon. Defeated and betrayed, even by his favorite son, John, Henry was compelled to recognize Richard as his heir. 2 days later, Henry passed away, leaving the Angevin Empire in Richard's hands but in a precarious state. Richard's coronation as King of England in 1189 was overshadowed by his focus on the Third Crusade. Before departing for the Holy Land, Richard worked to secure his position in France, consolidating alliances and marrying Berengaria of Navarre to counter threats from Toulouse and other hostile regions. His military exploits during the Crusades cemented his reputation as a fearless warrior, but his absence from England and his lands in France left them vulnerable to Philip II's relentless ambition. Philip didn't waste time. While Richard was away, Philip formed alliances with disaffected nobles in Aquitaine and Normandy and even struck a deal with John, who sought to claim the English throne for himself. Philip's campaigns during Richard's captivity saw him gain significant territory, including Gisors and parts of Normandy, though his attempts to incite widespread rebellion in Aquitaine largely failed due to Richard's strategic alliances with Navarre and local leaders. When Richard finally returned in 1194, his immediate focus was reclaiming his lost territories. His campaigns in France, marked by fierce battles and clever diplomacy, began to reverse Philip's gains. Notably, Richard's victory at Gisors in 1198 showcased his tactical brilliance, forcing Philip to agree to a truce. Yet, just as the Angevin Empire seemed poised for a resurgence, tragedy struck. In 1199, while suppressing a revolt in Limousin, Richard was mortally wounded by a crossbow bolt at Chalus-Chebrot. He succumbed to his injuries, leaving the empire in a fragile state once again. And after the death of King Richard I in 1199, his younger brother John hurried to Chinon, aiming to seize the Angevin treasury and assert his control over the vast and fragmented Angevin Empire. But it wasn't that straightforward. Angevin succession customs favored Duke Arthur, the son of Geoffrey of Brittany, over John. Arthur's claim gained the backing of the nobles in Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, throwing the empire into immediate turmoil. Philip II of France, sensing an opportunity, had already taken Evreux and the Norman Vexin, while Breton forces captured Angers. Le Mans outright refused to acknowledge John, forcing him to flee to Normandy, where he was officially recognized as Duke in Rouen on April 25, 1199. With newfound military confidence, John returned to Le Mans to punish its rebellious citizens before heading to England, where he was crowned king on May 27. England, thanks largely to figures like William Marshall and Archbishop Hubert Walter, threw its weight behind John. Aquitaine and Poitou, influenced by the steadfast support of John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, also aligned with him. However, regions like Anjou, Maine, and Brittany were a different story, remaining fiercely contested. Determined to solidify his rule, John returned to the continent. By September 1199, his forces captured Arthur and Constance, seemingly securing his succession. Yet this triumph was short-lived. Arthur managed to escape, rallying forces under Philip II's banner. In 1200, the Treaty of Le Goulet appeared to settle the chaos. Philip acknowledged John's claim to the Angevin lands, but at a cost. John ceded strategic territories, paid a hefty sum, and accepted Philip as his suzerain overlord, a significant blow to his authority. Nonetheless, John resumed consolidating power across Aquitaine and Poitou, taking hostages to secure loyalty. John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême in 1200, though politically strategic, sparked further unrest. Isabella had been promised to Hugh of Lusignan, whose anger over this slight led to escalating tensions. When John seized Lusignan territory, Hugh appealed to Philip II, who summoned John to his court. John's defiance resulted in Philip confiscating his continental lands in 1202 and officially recognizing Arthur as his vassal. The conflict intensified when John launched a daring attack on Mirbeau in August 1202, capturing Arthur and many of his allies. However, John's refusal to consult key allies like William de Roches on Arthur's fate alienated his supporters. Arthur's mysterious disappearance, widely believed to be murder at John's hands, further tarnished his reputation. By 1004, Normandy had fallen, and much of the once mighty Angevin Empire was lost to Philip. Eleanor of Aquitaine's death in 1204 further destabilized John's position in Poitou. Facing invasion from Castile and internal rebellion, John struggled to maintain his grip on the remaining territories. A brief military campaign in 1206 secured some regions of Aquitaine, but it was clear the Angevin Empire was a shadow of its former self. John's return to France in 1214, bolstered by alliances with the Holy Roman Empire, offered a fleeting chance at recovery. However, the disastrous defeat of his allies at the Battle of Bovines forced John to agree to the Truce of Chinon, halting hostilities until 1220. By then, the Angevin Empire was reduced to England, Gascony, Ireland, and a sliver of Poitou, a stark contrast to its zenith under Henry II. The internal unrest in England culminated in the signing of Magna Carta in 1215, an event that further weakened John's authority. When rebel barons invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne, John's position reached a breaking point. His sudden death from dysentery in 1216 marked the end of a turbulent and often disastrous reign. In the years that followed, the Angevin legacy lingered in political and cultural echoes, but the dream of a unified empire spanning England and France had unraveled, leaving a historical lesson in the perils of overextension and fractured loyalties.